Welcome the folks who are tuning in to Tampa History Center's Florida Conversations lecture series. If you're joining us live, welcome. If you're seeing us after the fact, we appreciate you tuning in as well. We are doing this with a few sponsors who have been longtime supporters of the History Center. I'd like to thank Raymond James for their title sponsorship of our Museums at Home program. And we'd also like to thank the continued sponsorship of WSF Public Media. They are a very long-time sponsor of the Florida Conversations series. Before we get started with today's Florida Conversations, I want to talk a little bit about what we've got going on in the History Center over the next month or so. Well, of course, History Center is open to the public with all the COVID precautions that we need to take. And we are doing a lot of online and in-person programming. So we're, of course, wrapping up December, but going into January, you can join Gloria Jean Roster for her Madden Fortune Taylor walking tour. It starts at 10 o'clock in the morning and will last about an hour and a half. And it will cover the really interesting history of one of the most important women, African-American women, in Tampa's late 19th century history. To find out more and to register for that walking tour, please go to the History Center's website, which is tampabayhistorycenter.org. And January 20th is the next Florida Conversations, and that will feature Noelle Smith, who recently translated, edited, and annotated a new book called Tampa, Impressions of an Immigrant. And that book was originally written in 1897 by a Cuban journalist named Win Galvez, who came to Tampa and spent quite a bit of time in Ybor City in West Tampa and wrote about, in some not so glowing terms, about what he experienced during his time here in Tampa. But now what you all have tuned in for, this month's Florida Conversations. So today we feature the true dean of Florida history, an American history professor, award-winning author, teacher, and historian. Gary Mormino is professor emeritus of history at the University of South Florida in St. Petersburg. He is also the recipient of the 2015 Florida Humanities Council a Lifetime Achievement Award for writing. He also serves as the humanitarian in residence for the Humanities Council. Dr. Mormino has written numerous books, including The Immigrant World of Ybor City and Land of Sunshine, State of Dreams, A Social History of Modern Florida. Today, Dr. Mormino will be discussing his new book, which I have a copy of right here, which is titled Millard Fillmore Caldwell, Governing on the Wrong Side of History. And so I'd like to welcome Dr. Mormino and just have Dr. Mormino give us a bit of an overview about Millard Caldwell, his life, and kind of what you mean by the title Governing on the Wrong Side of History.
Thank you, Rodney. I remember Rodney when he was a mere graduate student in his salad days. As I look at the screen, the background looks like Manhattan, but it's merely my living room and a kitchen cabinet. So Millard Fillmore Caldwell is one of the more interesting characters I've encountered. I had never written a biography before, and I always considered myself a social historian looking at the mess. But my work in World War II in Florida, I thought it might be interesting to try and write and explore biography. And I think Caldwell is a fascinating figure. When he died in early 1980s, I believe, you can make an argument he was the greatest living Floridian of his generation. Had never lost an election in his life. Only a few Floridians, Lawton Childs lately, Spencer Hollins, a governor, state senator, U.S. senator from the 30s to the 1960s. But Caldwell is less known than those. I think he should be better known. He is a perfect figure for 2020, our cancel culture. What do we do with someone like Millard Fillmore Caldwell, who never lost an election in his life, was a veteran of World War I, a dedicated civic servant, but he was also a racist? How do we reconcile the past and the present? It's history is a constant dialogue between the present and the past, and Caldwell is caught in that crossfire. So some background. Millard Fillmore Caldwell, first of all, the name. How many, the only question would be how many listeners know who Millard Fillmore was, and how many listeners know who Millard Fillmore Caldwell was? It might be more know the latter than the former. Millard Fillmore was an American president, I believe in the 1840s, and he ran for president in the 1850s. In 1856, Caldwell's father was born. And it's believed in East Tennessee, Millard Fillmore was popular because he was running on the Know Nothing ticket, which would be very popular today. It was an anti-immigrant ticket. In those days, it was against the Irish. That was the predominant immigrant group, the most unfavored group of the time. Caldwell was born in 1856. I'm sorry, his father was born in 1856. Caldwell was the last Florida governor born in the 19th century and the first governor born in the atomic age, to rule in the atomic age. He was born in 1897. He was a child of privilege, a very handsome man. I think you can make an argument, put up his the cover of the book again, the picture of Caldwell.
I have to talk because of the way we're sharing the screen, but I think 6'3" or 6'4", played as a football lineman for the University of Mississippi, had a life of privilege. He lassoed calves in California. He was on a plantation in Mississippi and Tennessee with his father. He had private tutors. He enrolled at Carson Newman College, his father's alma mater, and was expelled for apparently beating someone at a baseball game and starting a brawl. And he transferred to the University of Mississippi. He was on the University of Mississippi Rebels when they lost to Sewanee College, I think 73-0, the most lopsided game in college history. A veteran of World War I, and when he returned, he enrolled at law school at the University of Virginia, and he wound up in Florida kind of by accident. His father had purchased thousands of acres of timberland in Northwest Florida, and he arrives in Milton, Florida, I think in 1923 or 1924, to oversee the transfer of the property. And he never left. I think he was the lawyer for Santa Rosa County. And there's a proverbial story that one day he was listening to someone running for the U.S. Congress. And he went on stage and said, "You're an idiot," basically. And he soon became a candidate and defeated the rival. So Caldwell's first elected office was as a U.S. congressman from West Florida. And he was congressman from about 1928, I think, to 1940. He hated the New Deal, which was not that unusual, by the way. Everyone, I think, viewers would assume, well, what was not to like about the New Deal? Caldwell was philosophically opposed. I should add, by the way, his first elected office was in the Florida legislature in the 1920s. But became congressman later during the New Deal. And he is part of a galaxy of extraordinary future leaders: Lyndon Johnson, Sam Rayburn, many, many others viewers would recognize, but was kind of a curmudgeon. He didn't like the idea of massive spending for the people. He was in favor of military appropriations. He brought back, so he was a classic Southern Democrat who was kind of hypocritical. They loved the pork they were bringing back to the home district, but philosophically they opposed the New Deal because it was also providing new funds for African Americans.
he would have been a congressman at the same time as Claude Pepper, for instance, during that era. So he leaves Congress in 1940. He had paid his own way to Europe to see what was happening with Mussolini and Hitler, returns. And he buys an old plantation in outside Tallahassee in Leon County that he calls Harwood. The love of his life was his wife, who outranked him, by the way, when they were married. She was superintendent of schools in Virginia, came from an affluent family. They had, I believe, 2 daughters and a son. And one of the reasons he left Congress was right before he left, his only son was killed by a hit and run driver and never arrested. Caldwell never recovered from that. It was a serious wound, and he wanted to get out. He didn't like Washington politics anyway, so they bought a plantation, an antebellum plantation, where he was kind of a gentleman farmer. He was a working farm, and in 1946, he decides to run, actually in 1944, he decides to run for governor, in large part because he didn't like anyone running. The 2 major Democratic candidates, one listeners may recognize, one was the father of future U.S. Senator and Florida Governor Bob Graham. His name was Ernest Cap Graham from Miami-Dade. He represented the future of Florida. As so many new people were moving to South Florida. But in 1940, North Florida, this was a critical period in Florida history, when you could still win the governor's race if you won North Florida and Middle Florida. And the other candidate was a man named Lex Green, who had been a prominent member in the Florida legislature. He'd been a school principal. I believe he was elected to the Florida legislature when he was a freshman at the University of Florida from Union County in North Florida. And Caldwell was considered the bottom rail runner, and he wins an upset election. He wins a runoff against Lex Green. I think it's the last time in Florida history 2 North Florida politicians vied for the governorship, and he wins. Tampa Tribune endorsed him. Almost every major Florida newspaper endorsed Caldwell. He is the wartime governor. He's taking over from Spencer Holland, who he could have been twin brother with Spencer Holland. They were small town boys, World War I vets. Holland was an aviator in World War I. Both of them, they were rarities. Holland was a state legislator or a governor and U.S. senator. Caldwell was a state legislator and a governor, and could easily have become a U.S. senator had he wanted. We'll deal with that later. And cut me off when I'm out of time. So Caldwell is a very popular wartime governor. His World War II is a watershed for Florida. I've done a lot of work on World War II, and it's really extraordinary. For the first time, Florida is in the crosshairs of American history. Prior to that time, on the eve of World War II, Florida was the smallest state in the American South. It was smaller in 1940 than Arkansas or South Carolina. Today, we're the number 3 biggest state in the nation, bigger than New York. And World War II was that linchpin between a Florida that was very southern, very isolated, very underpopulated in the Florida today that we know. Caldwell was very uncomfortable, by the way, with that transition. He did not like big cities. He did not like Miami or Tampa or St. Petersburg. He was a small town guy. He wanted Florida to remain agricultural. He was a farmer. Probably the biggest single scandal, it's not scandal, but event in his administration, it was a scandal, was the Jesse Payne lynching in 1945. In 1945, the only lynching during World War II occurs in Florida. In Madison County, Jesse Payne, a black man, a white woman who later recanted her testimony, claimed that Payne had lynched her. Payne is liberated from his jail by the sheriff, and the citizens take him out and shoot him to death. Caldwell gets in the legal argument that it wasn't a lynching because he was killed by bullets, not by a hanging. And really is laughed at by the national media for drawing this kind of Jesuitical distinction, and does not come out looking good. But Caldwell's record on race is terrible. He defended lynchings at this time. So Caldwell leaves office in 1947. Actually, I think it might even be 49. Yeah, January 1949. Fuller Warren is the new governor. They did not like one another. He thought Warren was kind of a fool, much too casual with gamblers, not serious enough. And everyone, the rumors are Caldwell is going to run against Claude Pepper in 1950. There's no doubt in my mind Millard Caldwell would have demolished Claude Pepper, but Caldwell did not want to return to Washington because of his son. Ironically, he returns to Washington anyway because President Harry Truman calls him and said, America needs you. We're in a new era, the atomic era. We need a new chief, the first chief ever of the Federal Defense Administration, Civil Defense Administration. Duck and cover, bomb shelters, Soviet missiles aimed at us. And Caldwell, because he is a dedicated public servant, goes. He hated his 2 or 3 years he spent there. And it's probably one of the worst moments of his life. He has to appear in Congress for a congressional hearing. And African Americans are waiting for him. And Collins will not call professors, ministers, college presidents by their title. He will call them Joe or Jimmy. And they complain. He said, I'm sorry, this is the way we do this in the South. And Lyndon Johnson and Sam Rayburn, whom he had served with, managed to get him nominated and approved anyway, but it's not a happy time. For instance, one of the things he does is he wants to have segregated bomb shelters, that blacks and whites would have segregated where we all could be obliterated. So he returns to Florida. All the rumors of what's Millard Caldwell going to do? And finally, in 1961, almost the day after Ferris Bryant is elected, he is nominated to be a Supreme Court justice. And actually, he's the Chief Justice of the Florida Supreme Court. By this time in the 1960s rather, he's even more conservative. I write that he assumes almost the role of an Old Testament prophet, that America is a sinning land, liberalism, civil rights, communism is eating away at the foundation of America. And he does that for about a dozen years. And then in retirement, writes op-eds, et cetera. So he's a complicated figure.
Yeah, absolutely. Sounds like it. I have a few questions for you, of course. And anybody watching live, we welcome you to have any questions that you have about Millard Fillmore for Dr. Mormino. But while we wait for any questions that the live viewers may have, I'd like to go back to 1945, you'd mentioned particularly the Jesse Payne lynching, but something else of maybe not broader importance, but something that was going to lead to other changes in Florida was the special session in 1945 to discuss the constitutional requirement of reapportionment, and that from the 1885 Constitution dictated the apportionment of legislators by population, but even as of 1945, that really hadn't happened again. So, and what this, of course, you touched on this. It really was a North Florida versus South Florida battle that really started during Caldwell's term as governor.
I think that's one of the most fascinating segments in the book. The 45 legislature, Rodney's right, every 10 years, by requirement, Florida was supposed to reapportion. But North Florida, as I had indicated earlier, South Florida is growing so much more dramatically, in Central Florida, so much faster than North Florida. They realized their clout will end if they actually do this. So they simply ignored it for about 20 or 30 years. Caldwell is a stickler for the law. If it's in the Constitution, you've got to do this. And it's fascinating. First of all, legislatures are being paid $6 a day. And most of the legislators at this time, they did not own homes in Tallahassee. As cynics would argue, up until the 1960s, the Florida legislature met every other year for 60 days. Cynics thought it should have been the other way around. They should have met every 60 years for 2 days. But Caldwell was there and he demanded they meet. The air conditioning barely worked. It was hot. They had jobs elsewhere. Their families were elsewhere. They hated it. And finally, there's a meek compromise. South Florida receives a few more senators, but it simply, they put it off for another day. But my favorite character in the legislature, by the way, there's senators would bring their dogs with them. Their dogs would be biting other senators. My favorite Florida politician at that time is Wankard Pooser. And a journalist wrote, he looked just like someone named Wankard Pooser. He had such a sharp tongue, and his wife would sit behind him, his wife who bore his 9 children, and she would have to physically control him from physically attacking other legislators. You had spittoons in those days. Think of the 1945 Florida legislature as a vestige of the past. You had one woman, Mary Lou Baker from St. Petersburg, and you had one Republican, Alex Ackerman of Orlando, who later went on to fame. He was the defense attorney for the Groveland boys, the famous lynching of 1945. Some of readers may have read the Groveland boys. Is that the name of the book? Anyway, so Caldwell gets high praise and low praise. I think someone said they met for 60 days and Caldwell laid a mouse, which was not a flattering compliment. But it's a fascinating moment in Florida where you can see the past and the present. Or one of the cudgels South Florida legislators used was, we're going to move the capital from Tallahassee to Orlando. The capital, I mean, I'm sure viewers have often wondered, why in the world is the capital in Tallahassee? And that was part of the compromise. The capital would stay in Tallahassee and they would get a few more delegates. But it's high drama. I like that subchapter a lot.
Yeah. So Devil in the Grove, or Devils in the Grove.
Thank you. Yes.
The Groveland book. One of our viewers noted that. There's another question that we have about Caldwell's Supreme Court time, but I don't want to get away from the governorship quite yet, because another important aspect of this time, dealing, very specifically with race, was the white primary. You'd mentioned that Caldwell won in a runoff, the Democratic primary, but you didn't even talk about the general election, and that's because it wasn't really an issue at that time. So can you talk a little bit about what the white primary system was? And that actually the 1944 election was probably one of the last ones where the white primary was as dominant a force. So talk a little bit about what the white primary did and how it disenfranchised African Americans.
The authority, by the way, on the white primary is Pam Iorio, who wrote her master's thesis on the white primary. But the white primary was a brilliantly, if diabolical, tactic. The Democratic Party. So after Reconstruction, Democrats were obsessed with the idea, how can we retain power with a growing Black population and newcomers in the state? And one of their great fears is what would happen if African Americans and poor whites would combine into a poor people's party and take over the state. So in around 1905, 1909 in Florida, can you still see me?
I can see you, but I can't see myself. I've gone.
Well, you're not important.
Well, they're not here to see me.
Man.
Now they can see me.
So around 1909, Florida, other states had also done this. Democrats are always obsessing over the court. What will happen? We have to be one step ahead of the court. And so they come up with the idea of the white primary. That, they had tried the 8-box law, the poll tax, which, by the way, I think was outlawed during Caldwell's administration. Claude Pepper was one of the proponents of that. But the white primary was brilliant. The strategy was that only Democrats can vote in the primaries. And you have to realize this was a one-party state. For every 10 Democrats, I think there are about 2 Republicans. Republicans are an afterthought. They're not even a rival in Florida until really the 1960s. So the idea is you keep the African Americans voting from the only election that matters, the primary. And as there was an old saying, the primary is tantamount to election. When Caldwell was elected governor in 1944, the story, I think, was on page 3, because everyone knew he was going to win the election. Franklin Roosevelt winning the presidency, that was the big story on the front page. But it's outlawed in April of 1944 during the gubernatorial race. It doesn't affect the gubernatorial race because, for all purposes, Florida simply ignores it, as will the rest of the South. And curiously, Florida and Tennessee are the only 2 southern states that really obey the law. If you're an African American living in a city in Florida, Jacksonville, Gainesville, Tampa, you can generally vote in the primary by 1945, 1946, not in small towns. So you can see this is I can't stress enough, this is such a turbulent period of race relations, political change, rural, urban, the shift in Florida from North Florida to South Florida. One of the heroes in that, by the way, is Francisco Rodriguez, who returns from the Marines. He was a Black Marine in World War II, a rarity to say the least, and is leading that fight for African Americans to register and vote as Democrats. Some viewers might be shocked, the idea most African Americans until the 1930s were Republicans, the party of Lincoln.
Mm-hmm.
Was I going into, did I miss something?
No.
Okay. All
right. So I want to go to a couple of our viewer questions here. And so we're going to jump around historically, or at least chronologically, because the questions do so, which is fine. you touched on Caldwell's career when he was Chief Justice of the Florida Supreme Court, and so one of our viewers, Charles Nelson, would like to know if you could, Dr. Mormino, comment on Caldwell's impact on the court. Were there any particular cases dealing with integration, segregation that he would have heard during this time, and where his viewpoints would have made an impact on the ruling?
The one I particularly remember, the Florida version of Loving versus Georgia, the right of interracial marriage, Caldwell ruled against. In some way, he railed against the Brown decision. Caldwell was going crazy living in Tallahassee. Some of the viewers may have been undergraduates in Tallahassee in the 60s. Tallahassee was quite a liberal bastion at that time, FSU. And ironically, Florida State had a very conservative president whose name I've forgotten. I've met a few times. He was an interesting guy. The name just escapes me. But those two cases really on the Brown decision and challenges to that and the Loving decision. He was also against the constitutional revision. In 1968, Florida rewrote its constitution. He was dragging his feet the entire time, resisting it. I think he said famously, the worst thing that ever happened to Florida was labor unions, which he didn't like either. So
exactly. So going a question that kind of brackets Caldwell's life. You think you mentioned this, but we can confirm. What type of education did Caldwell have, and did he attend any school in Florida? And then going toward the end of his life, did he ever change his, in the questioner's words, his racist views?
So in the first part, no, he never attended. He attended his K through 12 experience was everywhere from Mississippi to Tennessee to California, often private tutors. He once said, what was fascinating about Caldwell, in many ways he was an aristocrat, but he could speak cracker. And he was saying he remembered his favorite tutor was a woman teacher in a one-room school in California who he said was, quote, as mean as gar broth, G-A-R. Now, how many viewers know what a gar was? A gar is a kind of an armored fish, a long, slender fish with it looks like it almost has armored plate on. And no one eats it, but Caldwell, apparently poor people, desperate poor people would make a broth, a fish broth out of it. Caldwell he first enrolled at, what was the school? Carson Newman, because his father had been a graduate there, but he's thrown out of school. He's expelled, I think, his sophomore year, and he finishes at the University of Mississippi, where he played football as starting guard on the Rebel team. And he attended law school at the University of Virginia. So he had rather an impressive education, to say the least. And what was the second part of the, no, he never, at least nothing that I have found, even on his deathbed, he was a hardcore segregationist. And I've often had an imaginary conversation with Caldwell. I think his biographers do. And Caldwell is just screaming at me saying, you don't understand the way of life it was then. This was the Southern way of life. And you're writing revisionist history. And Caldwell, it's very interesting. Think about this. We like politicians who don't change, who are hardcore to their principles. That was Millard Caldwell, but he would have been a much more sympathetic character had he been more sympathetic to the civil rights movement. So is that a fundamental flaw in Caldwell, or is that part of his armor? probably both.
Mhm. And so, just to go back to the education question, so many politicians during Caldwell's time went to the University of Florida,
Yes.
and I must say, go Gators, because but he didn't. But it seemed like even when his campaign, he felt the need
Yes.
to express his Gator bona fides, even though he
Yes.
didn't go there. Can you? It's a fun story. So can you briefly tell
Yeah,
that?
thanks for bringing that up. Both Lex Green was a University of Florida grad. I think he may have been even Senate body president. And Ernest Graham was not a graduate. He was a graduate, I think, of South Dakota State. He was an engineer, but his son, Phil Graham, Bob Graham's half brother, was not only a University of Florida grad, he was student body president. He's an extraordinary character. Some viewers may know that during World War II, when he had been commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Navy, an ensign, he met Catherine Meyer in Washington, D.C., and they fell in love and married. Her father owned the Washington Post. So Phil Graham was a major player, that is Ernest Graham's son, using those University of Florida connections. And of course, Bob Graham was a Gator. But you're right, Bob, during the campaign, both Graham and Green emphasized their Gator connections. And Caldwell would take out ads. Do you want a better University of Florida football team? I do too. We want to beat the University of Georgia. And I promise you, if I'm elected governor, I will funnel more money into the University of Florida athletic department, which he did. I don't think they were any better, by the way.
No.
Still the years were horrible.
Yeah, they were. Which is funny because he wasn't really one to make a lot of campaign promises. That was almost his campaign promise was to not make campaign promises. And so it's
yes. And that's almost a ridiculous campaign promise if you think about it. You're really well, anyway.
So going to more questions we have. This one is from Facebook, from one of your former students. There are thousands out there. But Rex Gordon, his question is, he said Caldwell wanted to close the bars in Florida when Japan surrendered to end World War II. Was Caldwell against drinking?
No, Caldwell was against mayhem. Always good to hear from a former student. I remember that young man. He's destined for greatness. I'm sure he's a CEO right now. But this was pretty common across the South, really across America. They were greatly. Let me retry. No one knew when the war would end. And no one could have imagined 2 atomic bombs in the face of a week and a half. And World War II ended sooner than that. And most people thought the war would go on in January. By the way, I might not be here. My father was at Okinawa preparing for the invasion. And so there was great fear that there would be rioting in the streets in the good sense. So in general, all the liquor shops, but people had plenty of liquor. By the way, I think VJ Day, August 14th, August 15th, 1945, qualifies as the happiest day in American history. Think about that. Most of the things we've talked about tonight are depressing. Race relations, lynchings, racism, all those things. VJ Day is pure delirium and happiness. The boys are coming home sooner than anyone thought. Most of them are going to come back alive. Everyone's going to need a new car, a new house, a new bride. Ross Mormino marries Mabel Dingle in January 1946. 3 months later, I'm born. So it's an incredibly and it's the most hopeful period in American history. Compared to Europe, Asia, our cities had not been bombed. everyone's going to get a job. And if you want to go to college, the American university system is transformed by the GI Bill. It's a remarkable period, that post-war period, 45, 46. One of my favorite periods to study. In Canada, by the way, a reporter wrote that some blondes would only kiss Navy personnel, some would only kiss officers.
Well, it's a celebration. We'll have to be discerning.
Yes.
So we probably have a few more questions coming in from the live folks, but I have a few more questions as well for you, Gary. And really, it's almost kind of an amalgam of questions, looking at Caldwell's time and comparing it with our time today. When Caldwell was governor, the governor's position was a weak one, and politically, he was a Democrat because everybody was a Democrat. But did he really adhere to a party platform, or because there's only one Democratic Party, or are there really kind of multiple Democratic Party platforms to fit the conservative or more liberal nature of the person?
That's a good question. Yes, and the answer is the Democratic Party was a vast constituency. For instance, the Tampa Tribune played a tremendous role, then called the Tampa Morning Tribune. It was rather liberal, progressive. If Caldwell had a single legislative achievement, it's what was called the Minimum Foundation Act, the Minimum Foundation Program of 1945-46, which no one remembers now. But Caldwell came to office. In some ways, he's refreshing. He tells Floridians, he's rather blunt about this, you want better education for your kids. Well, you're going to have to pay for it. Who says that now? And he meant it. And the Tampa Morning Tribune, I think between 45 and 46, did a front page story almost every single day, because I've read them, talking about how awful Hillsborough County schools were. Where if you were in Hyde Park and went to Plant High, you had a great education. If you were in the rural county in Cork, in Plant City, if you were African American, you had a terrible education. And the funds were, almost no funds from the Tallahassee came to Hillsborough County. They were all local funds. And Caldwell says, if we're going to be a more progressive state, we have to have a better educational system. And one of the reforms was, if you were superintendent of schools, you had to have a college degree. Many people were, it was the brother-in-law of the sheriff who was the superintendent of schools. Every school had to go a set number of minimum days a year. Up to that time, Cork might go to school 150 days a year, whereas Plant High, 250 days a year. Vast inconsistencies. He also improved the African American schools, probably not because he wanted to, but he wanted to keep the feds from coming in and reform and doing it for him. So that's Caldwell's greatest legislative achievement. It's also the shining moment of the Tampa Morning Tribune. How many viewers out there remember the name Jock Murray? Jock Murray may have been Florida's greatest journalist. The late Leland Hawes loved Jock Murray, by the way.
So we talked, quite a bit about the power of party, and it is, almost inconceivable for certainly the younger folks tuning in to realize how much power the Democratic Party had. But there was a change after Caldwell left office. Did Caldwell himself ever change party affiliation? And even if he didn't, do you think that he would have aligned himself more politically with the modern Republican Party?
You would think so, but I have no evidence that he ever approved of the modern Republican Party or voted for a Republican. He's what you would call, the older viewers would know the term, a yellow dog Democrat. he would sooner vote for a cur dog than a Republican. And in fact, we had to change the introduction of the book. The Andy Frank of Florida State wrote that Caldwell had done exactly what you said. And I said, no, he as far as I know, he never approved of a Republican candidate. He disapproved of some Democrats, but he was a party guy. I mean, he was a team player.
And speaking of disapproving of some Democrats, you mentioned that had he run against Claude Pepper in 1950, you believe he would have won. Claude Pepper is another person that if those viewing this don't know that name, they certainly should.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about Claude Pepper and the contrast with Millard Caldwell and Pepper.
You know, when I finished the Ybor City book in 1986, I wanted to write a biography of Claude Pepper. He was at his zenith as a U.S. Senator in 1986. And I wrote him, and he would not grant me an interview. So I changed. And several colleagues told me, ask your students in 25 years, how many of you, and I actually do this still in class, the first day of Florida history class, if you can write an intelligent paragraph about Claude Pepper or Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, I'll give you an A. You can walk away, and no one's ever won the challenge. Claude Pepper.
Don't offer me that, Gary. So let's just.
Claude Pepper is one of my favorite politicians, and in so many ways, he's the antithesis, but a mirror of Millard Caldwell until the 1960s. Claude Pepper is also a native Southerner. Unlike Caldwell, he is poor. He is a cracker from Dudley, Alabama. I don't think he had a pair of shoes, new shoes, until he was in high school. University of Alabama. He, like Caldwell, was a World War I vet. He never crossed the ocean, but he used what in effect was a GI Bill to go to Harvard Law. Claude Pepper is really smart. And he taught 1 year at the University of Arkansas. He falls in love with the president's daughter, and she rebuffed him, and he was so humiliated. He came, of all places, to Hernando County, Florida, to sell land and look over titles. And then he moves to Perry, Florida. Taylor County is about as impoverished a county in Florida, but he's elected to he was serving at the same time as Caldwell, but on very different platform. And he's rebuffed by Taylor County voters in 1930 because of race. He had been sympathetic to a racial incident, and he's voted out of office, and he moves to Tallahassee, where in 1935, he should have won the U.S. Senate seat. Now think about that. He had spent one term in the Florida House, undistinguished, and he almost won the U.S. Senate race in 1935. Some of the listeners may have known the late Manny Garcia. Manny Garcia told Leland Halls and me in an interview that he was present when they basically tore up all the ballots and tilted the election in 1930. It's actually 1934, not 1935, but to Park Trammell. And Caldwell, Pepper loses, but he's a gracious loser. And the following year, in 1935, within 30 days, both U.S. senators in Florida die. Park Trammell and Duncan Fletcher. And because Caldwell had been a team player, he's awarded an uncontested U.S. Senate seat, where he will sit until 1950, when George Smathers, Gorgeous George, knocks him out. But up to that time, Caldwell and Pepper have identical policies toward race. Both of them had filibustered against the anti-lynching bill. Really, Pepper even more illustrative than Caldwell. And Pepper later confessed to an interviewer, I had to do it. I could not sympathize with African Americans and be elected in the American South at that time. I hated myself. So, which leads to an interesting question. Should we admire Caldwell for being honest, or should we criticize Pepper for being a hypocrite? But Pepper refurbishes his image when he moves to Miami, and in 1962, the same year as Tampa's Sam Gibbons, he's elected to the U.S. Congress, very liberal Jewish district in Miami, and he becomes the voice of Southern liberalism, particularly on three issues, on race, on old age, and on economics. And that's the Pepper everyone remembers. And he died in 1989, and he's an icon now. But he's complicated.
Well, as are most people.
Most humans are complicated.
So one question from another viewer asking about Caldwell, if he had any specific connections to Tampa.
Other than he hated the Tampa Tribune, he really, even though the Tribune endorsed him, I think until the very end, he felt, because the Tribune was so aggressive in its investigative reporting, particularly on the Claude Neal, the lynching incident, and just there's a anyway, he did not like, and when he would come for county fair, that used to be a big event, the state fair, he would always shake his finger at the Tribune reporters for being unsympathetic. But he was not a city guy. He was really, he said his happiest days were when he retired on his farm in Tallahassee. By the way, if there are any law school graduates from Florida State, his dairy barn, I think, is one of the administrative buildings at FSU Law School today, which may be dismantled even as we speak right now.
Wow. Okay, one more question. And so I will kind of read it as written. With racist leaders like Caldwell in Florida and all throughout the South, how is the modern Democratic Party able to shake off this past to where most people today do not realize this past of governing on the wrong side of history?
Good question. And I'm writing about that right now in a book about, I've got a book that's coming out in Florida between 2000 and 2010. But in the background, the key period is the 1960s and the 1970s. By that time, it's a Florida turned upside down. 2/3 of the voters now live in Central and South Florida. Miami-Dade, Palm Beach, the Gold Coast, Hillsborough, and Pinellas, that's where the votes are. And there's a Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court decision in 1962, Baker versus Carr. It's popularly called one man, one vote, but it basically said you cannot keep this mal-apportioned legislature. So they finally, Caldwell's ghost appears, they finally reapportion the legislature according to population. And you have a whole new generation of liberal Democrats come in. From Tampa, Louis Delaparte, who's the gentleman who just died, prominent in the med school.
Is it Park Trammell or?
No, gosh, he was a very good man. But Bob Graham is part of that generation. It's an extraordinary change, though. At the same time, in the 70s, you have an environmental movement, an emerging environmental movement, because of, I think, Floridians finally wake up and what are we doing to our land? So that's a really good question, though. So it's a Democratic Party that almost has nothing in common with the one in the 1940s except the name. Oh, what was that gentleman's name? I bet a listener will. He died about a year ago.
Oh, Terrell Sessoms.
Terrell Sessoms.
Yeah, thank you, Diane.
Idea of how much clout Hillsborough County had. In one particular overlap, the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate were Terrell Sessoms and Louis Delaparte. That is why USF has a medical school. Good graft.
And so we need to start wrapping things up. And so then we have one question that is the true wrap-up question, which I'll wait and ask. But you alluded to this in the beginning, and so I think we'll kind of end where we began. And that's, how do we deal with people from a different time? It's not like he lived 500 years ago.
Boy, I wish I had a neat answer, and I'm still struggling with this. On the one hand, as alluded to by your reader, it's unfair with different values in different times, and yet people like Claude Pepper could rise out of that. People like Leroy Collins, Reuben Askew. There's a famous line: history rewards the brave, but admires the wise. I think Caldwell was brave, but Collins was wise. And by the way, Leroy Collins never won an election again. He paid dearly for his price of coming to a reckoning over the race issue. It's still an issue today. The Black Lives Matter probably caused the election to go to Trump. I think people, many were really turned off by the riots in the streets. So the debate continues today. It's not over. It will be very interesting. Will there, for instance, nice way to tie this up, the very first Jackson Day Springtime in Tallahassee Festival, Millard Caldwell rode the steed horse, and he had on Andrew Jackson's uniform. Caldwell and Jackson are very similar. Very proudful men, both from Tennessee. Both of them would have fought a duel if you had criticized their wives. By the time Caldwell died, Jackson horse was like in the fourth row. Jackson is now out of the Springtime Tallahassee Parade altogether, which used to be known as Jackson Day. So we're having a national conversation. It's a very uncomfortable one. I think Andrew Jackson was a great man with great flaws. I really do. Yes, he was a racist. Yes, he owned slaves. Yes, he killed Indians. He also sacrificed everything for his country. Had he lost the Battle of New Orleans, he would have been drawn and quartered. His family probably would have been liquidated. So he also expanded the franchise. Poor white men now could vote because of. So the debate is not over. It's a complicated debate, but it's a fascinating debate.
It is, and it kind of goes to show the value of history, and that there is a lot of gray area. Things aren't as clear as they sometimes we'd like them to be. Last question, and we'll take this last question from our viewer, unless there's another one pops up in the next minute or so. And again, good place to end, I believe, with this question. Where was Caldwell when he died? And what was his cause of death?
I don't know. I'm assuming he was at his plantation, Harwood. I'm embarrassed that I don't know that. I don't know his last words. It might be Cap Graham lives or something like that. But I don't know.
Was he a fairly old man when he passed away?
What's that?
Was he a fairly old man when he passed away?
He was 84 years old, which is an old man of that generation. He had two daughters. The daughters are now dead. So I have not heard from any of the Caldwell family. I don't know whether the family's still there in Tallahassee. I'd love to know whether they hate me or like the book. I mean, as you can tell, I'm conflicted. I admire Caldwell, but condemn him at the same time. And I don't really know what to, if the decision were mine, I don't know what I would do about the Caldwell building. He didn't like the building anyway. It was kind of a Great Society building, which he didn't approve of. So he probably wouldn't have minded it being called the Great Society building.
Yeah. Claude Pepper Annex.
Yes, right.
So I just had, when you mentioned that you had not contacted the family, I had this memory of the story of your Ybor City book when the two sons or grandsons wanted to come to your office and beat you up because you called their father or grandfather an anarchist.
That was what was the name of the family? I was in my library. I was in the library at USF in 1987. And I get a phone call and said, would you turn to page 143 and would you read the last sentence from the bottom? And it says, among the prominent anarchists in Tampa was Giuseppe Francone. And he said, stop. He said, that's my father. You called my father an anarchist. He said, are you going to be in your office in 10 minutes? If so, I'm going to come and kick your ass. And he shows up. And I got to know him and his four brothers. They were all World War II heroes, by the way. And they eventually sent me a package in the mail, which was not a bomb. And I opened it, and they had done a biography of their father. And the title was Our Father, the Anarchist. They concluded their father was an anarchist, but he was a good anarchist, not a bomb thrower.
Well, I think the good anarchist is a good way for us to end this.
Yes.
So thank you to all who tuned in, both live and those who are viewing this video. Thank you very much, Gary.
Yes.
We really appreciate you joining us.
I thank the viewers. Get the book in the library. Don't buy it. But I'd love to hear from your what you think of it. Thanks.
Thanks, Gary.
Yes. Ciao, bella. Buona fortuna. Avanti, sempre.